and I want to clarify that based on Tanya's introduction, no advancements shown today in the sediment transport world, but we are going to be looking at hydrodynamic modeling coupled flow and waves and how that can influence potential sediment transport pathways. And we'll be doing that specifically in the case of looking at an embayment with these channel adjacent placements of BUDM, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But I'd like to acknowledge my team members. I'm just a small part of this team. It's been going on for quite some time. And this work in particular was supported by assistance from Deb Kraft, Rachel Bain, Jack Haddigat, Richard Stiles, and we had a summer intern, Mary Jansen. So the motivation of this work, as I mentioned, this is part of a larger effort that was broadly developed, the work group, to develop guidance on life cycle management of wetland nourishments, but specifically developing guidance that is beneficial for coastal navigation purposes. In FY 22 and 23, which is when I joined the group at the very end of FY 22, the focus shifted specifically to the case of channel adjacent islands. So these have existed for quite some time. What I'm showing here are screenshots, aerial overview of imagery from Clearwater, Florida, and Galveston, Texas, and the blue boxes are showing where the navigation channel is. And there's numerous reasons why material can be placed right next to a channel, largely motivated by reducing costs. It's very easy to move material from where you picked it up to right next to the dredging activity. But they're also developed intentionally with the idea that it could create habitat for either wetland or grasses or any kind of species of local species that may be losing intertidal or wetland area. So these channels can supplement those losses. The specific work was also motivated by several statements of needs of the past, including sustainable dredge sediment management practices to support wetlands and nearshore replacement for wetland nourishment. And we're excited that we have the most recent statement of need that was well reviewed by the field. So we know that this is a important topic, but thinking about the multi-scale analyses of BUDM impacts on long-term navigation channel maintenance. So one place in particular that has these long islands as compared to smaller chains of islands, there's quite a few in Lake Calcasieu, Louisiana. And this is a microtidal embayment, but it does see a good amount of port activity, and it's currently maintained to a 40-foot draft. And you can see, for reference, we're at Erdick. So that's how far away we are from this site. And the aerial view of modern imagery shows these green features that are lining the navigation channel. Lake Calcasieu is an interesting system in particular because it has a rich history of documenting the evolution of these islands over time. So in 1930 or prior to 1935, the system was more or less unmodified in that the draft within the curving natural channel was maintained at 6.5 feet deep. And there is a path that's about 6.5 feet deep that goes through the center of the bay. But at prior to 1956, but you can see here, the navigation channel was straightened or a path was carved through that created a more direct route. And over time, different dredging activities added to or led to the accumulation and placement of BUDM along the channel. And again, here's the modern imagery. So Lake Calcasieu has also been the subject of previous work, both at Burdick and outside of Burdick. In previous work was focused more on the sediment budget and closing that budget. And some previous research here indicated from some really interesting isotope analysis done by David Perkey and his group that the sediment, the source of shoaling and dredge sediment in the lower portion of the channel, so up to River Mile 5, which I don't know if we can cursor, but I have River Mile 5 indicated on the figure. The source of that sediment is predominantly marine. And above that, the source of sediment has indicators of being riverine in source. So not a lot of additional sources maybe that were found in that work.
You can move your cursor to that other.
Oh yeah, okay. However, in that work and some modeling work by Gary Brown and his group indicated that although they believe and do a really great job of accounting for where those sources come from or the sources of sediment, it doesn't necessarily, when you model these processes, it doesn't necessarily close the sediment budget. So of course, a sediment transfer modeling is very challenging, but there's still some uncertainty about different sources of sediment, regardless of what their magnitude may be. The Water Institute, formerly of the Gulf, did some study on Lake Calcasieu in 2019, and they indicated that there is some evidence that the shoreline or the banks of the islands could be a source of material, although they don't quantify what the total contribution would be. They also estimate about 10% might come from annual tropical cyclones in the area and the region. And as Tanya mentioned, about a month ago, Jack Hadigan showed how there is a strong correlation between wetland loss in the interior of the marshes. So throughout here, that correlates with dredging, not dredging activity, oil and gas activity in building of canals. And so that sediment is hypothesized to eventually make its way into the lake around here in the southeastern portion. This work is different, so taking a shift in the direction, so not really trying to determine, get a balance of zero or by any means, but instead just thinking about how do these topographic features, i.e. the islands, modify sediment transport pathways. Combined with the visual history that we have showing the change in geometry of Lake Calcasieu over time, we also have a pretty detailed dredging history, and Rachel Bain did a lot of really excellent work combining these modern reports with annual reports to the chief of engineers on civil works activities, and she went through almost 100 years of records to determine what maintenance dredging was done in different volumes of those actions over time. And what you're seeing here is the cumulative maintenance dredging volume of all of Lake Calcasieu. So this includes the lake and the river and the pass. So all sections of the channel, I want to specify. And you can see that, oh, and this is just for maintenance, so not new work. And you can see that the construction of the channel and the subsequent deepening, it led to, or excuse me, coincides with changes in channel shoaling rate. So it's not a huge change, maybe between these three periods, as it would be, you know, between the pre-modification and post-modification, but it's something worth noting and thinking about, and that's part of where this work steps in. So would there have been potential changes in shoaling rate due to the construction of these channels or the islands? Okay, so where are we now? So what I've just shown is a lot of history, and now we are working to, or what we've done is taken this handwritten history and are now putting that into modern numerical tools to kind of do a reanalysis of how the hydrodynamics of the system behaved at different points in Lake Calcasieu's evolution. So what you're seeing here is generally a timeline of the different evidence that we have. And those blue vertical lines indicate changes in the navigation channel depth. And the red arrows indicate times where we have geo-rectified nautical charts. And so what we did is use these nautical charts to go into our GIS and digitize shorelines, as well as the available scatter data that we had for inside the bay. And with that, we turned that into CMS grids. So the general morphology you can see, or the scope of the grid, this is not the entire grid, to clarify, I'll zoom out in a little bit, but it goes up to 10 meters offshore, so not super far out, but I can talk about that in a little bit. But you can see by zooming in that we're accounting for the change in water, or the location of the islands with time. So this is, here we go. Okay, so these bare spots indicate where there is a island in our numerical model, and the imagery doesn't quite line up just right, because to remind us, these are from almost 100 years ago, or 50 to 80 years ago. So the imagery isn't quite the same. But you can also see that we have a change in depth of the navigation channel from 30 feet to 35 feet and 40 feet over time. And you can see that that navigation channel is not in our control bathymetry. So this is the channel Lake Calcasieu as it existed prior to channelization and deepening. Okay. So to compare those simulations or those bathymetries with a possible alternative history where the material that was dredged in the channel was moved offshore as opposed to right next to the navigation channel, we also did some numerical modeling for these three cases. So you see this, the navigation channel is still there with 3 different depths, but instead we've assumed that those islands are no longer there, and their depths now correlate or correspond to the water depths at that location in the bay, indicated by similar regions without islands. Okay, so now we've got a lot of different bathymetries. Now what do we do with them? Well, we ran some CMS flow and wave simulations. And what we decided to do, we talked about this quite a bit. How do we determine, do we want to run a full year of, sediment transport? And we thought, well, that doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense since we don't have a lot of data to validate that. So instead, what we did was ran a 30-day period that represented a full tidal cycle for the region. And the reason we chose a more winter time period was because the lake itself can be wind dominated in terms of the direction, and I'll show you that in a minute. But as I said, it's microtidal, it's fairly sheltered, so offshore waves aren't huge. And because the channel is, or the inlet is shaped the way it is, there's not a lot of wave intrusion into the system as a whole. So it's not really a wave dominant system. But we did use available NUBC buoys to come up with a representative John Swap spectrum, and that's what I'm showing in the bottom left. We also used Open Mesh 2D to determine what the dominant tidal amplitudes and phases were for the tidal boundary, which are, so the waves and the tides are both applied at this meter offshore boundary. A note here, I have this little asterisk because recently CMS, I guess this is an advancement, CMS is now able to map spatially varying tidal constituents to a grid. And that's something that we've been working on and had some bugs with before. So the most recent version of the code online should have the ability to run a tidal simulation that can compute spatially varying tidal boundary conditions, and that can be coupled with a CMS flow simulation. So we have our tides, and we used constant offshore waves in stream flow, which was taken as the mean of the record for the USGS gauge in Kinder, Louisiana, and that is showing the point of the boundary. And that's just stream flow, so no sediment flux is included there. What we did vary is over time for the wind fields. So the wind behavior in the system is really interesting. When we saw that, annual monthly averages were highest in winter, we started looking at those time series. And what I'm showing here is a January to end of March time series of wind magnitudes in color, and that's meters per second. And the direction, I broke it up into the 4 cardinal directions plus the in between, and you can see that there's these really interesting stradiations in the wind direction with time, which indicate that the winds are actually rotating during this period. And when we went, these are just 3 samples, but there's a very similar pattern really for all the years. And we went through and found the approximate rotation period for that change in wind direction and coupled that with, I believe it was, 5% exceedance magnitudes for each of those directions. Then we came up with this rotating wind field. So here I'm indicating what the actual magnitudes are that we're modeling. So between about 10 and 15 meters per second, and the direction changes every 10 days, give or take. Okay, now that we have all of the hydrodynamic forcing, we run our simulations, what do we get? So what I'm showing here are the tidal dynamics and statistics that I got from T-tide, which is a function that is well documented and trusted, like it runs on MATLAB and possibly Python. There we go. Okay, so you can see these are the dominant tides in the region. Really, K1 is the most dominant, but these are the two diurnal, semi-diurnal tides. And you can see the overtide of the M2 tide is here in this middle figure here. So the colors indicate the geometry and the dashed, or excuse me, the period in time, which corresponds to navigation channel draft, which I'm showing here with red, green, and blue, progressively over time, Roy Biv. And then the dashed line indicates the same configuration of a channel, but without islands. So in the hypothetical case where all the dredge material was moved offshore or out of the system. The black line is the pre-modification condition. So we see generally that the channelization, so any color line as opposed to black, results in more or less a decrease in the dominant tidal amplitudes, M2 and K1, which you can see here and here, and an increase in the nonlinear overtide. So that's the M4 here. At amplitude of apologies, I have this in kilometers now, so it's not river miles, it's river kilometers 3+. So at really like the 3rd kilometer inland, which is kind of around here, we actually see growth of the M4 overtide, which you can think of as generally or typically what we see is a dissipation of the dominant tide, and that causes a nonlinear transfer of energy, kind of like a wave, into the higher harmonic M4 tide. Now, when we compare the solid lines and the dashed lines, which is the case of islands and no lines respectively, the islands tended to increase the M4 amplitude, so additional friction when the islands are present, and increase or decrease the dominant constituent amplitude, not really a consistent trend there. But as a result of those, comprehensively, when we combine all of that information, we see that channelization does increase the tidal prism, which conceptually makes sense. We have deeper depths, and that allows more water to enter into the channel upstream. Excuse me, and that the islands increase the tidal prism up to a certain distance up the channel, but then past that point, the prism decreases considerably, and that was particularly true of the 40-foot case. So these dashed lines here, the colors are not really translating well. I apologize, but this is the point at which the 40-foot draft case switches from being more or less unaffected by the presence of the islands. And then once we get up to, I guess, not too far in, about 4 kilometers, you see a much greater tidal prism when the islands are not present. And the same is true, we have flipping points and trends further upstream for the 30-foot and 35 draft case. Okay, what does this mean for velocities in the channel? How does this, how do those tidal prisms and, tidal amplitudes how are those expected to modify flow in the channel, the actual velocities themselves? Interestingly, we saw that the islands did not have a huge impact on the, ebb and flood velocities, and these are here plotted as a function of, distance of the channel as well. Okay. Except in the case of the 40-foot draft, we did see, so the dashed line is here, the blue dashed line is here. So, much stronger ebb velocities when the islands are not present for the deep draft case. For the rest of them, the 30-foot and 35-foot draft, the islands don't appear to have a huge effect on the magnitude of the ebb and flood velocities. Finally, this bottom figure here is showing the ratio of the cubed ebb and flood velocities, which is what is often done to get a sense of whether or not net transport will be ebb dominant or flood dominant. And so greater than, so this is actually the log scale. So greater than 1 indicates ebb dominant, and below 1 indicates a flood dominant system. So we can see that with the channel, each of the configurations kind of shifts from being ebb dominant up to a certain point, maybe 10, 15 kilometers. And then once we get into the lake itself, so about 10 kilometers, then we have get into a more flood dominant system. But interestingly, so this solid blue line appears to be very flood dominant, so with the islands present. But the no island case for the 40-foot draft doesn't appear to have such a flood dominance. Okay, that was kind of all a teaser for these particle tracking work that we've been working on and are still kind of synthesizing all the results of. But what I'm going to show here is a movie, and this is Lake Calcasieu, and there's going to be a series of particles that come out of this source point here, which is very close to where eroded interior wetlands are thought to be entering the system, the Lake Calcasieu lake system. The color bar will indicate mean water level, or excuse me, spatially varying water surface level data in terms of meters. So basically you'll see the tide coming in, and then we'll also have a rotating wind field, and the red dot indicates the direction the wind is coming from. And so blowing to, and you'll see that this is so result of the particle tracking model for a 30-day simulation. So we don't have to sit here and watch the whole thing, but we do see that when the wind comes out of the southwest, we do see that the particles are responding to that significantly. So we know that circulation in the lake is primarily wind dominated, and that is echoed by our contacts at the Morelands District who are familiar with the area. Okay, so here I am noting that the particles are treated as neutrally buoyant, and this is one particular topography configuration. When we say neutrally buoyant, we just mean that what you're really seeing is really a pathway of a water particle more so than a sediment particle. There's not assumed to be any drag. This particle isn't going up and down in the water column, but it does give a good indicator of the pathway that suspended sediment would take. So we ran these neutrally buoyant particle tracking simulations for all of our oh, I forgot to bring the legend over, but, red, excuse me, indicates the 30-foot draft, and the thicker line is for the case of with islands, and the thinner line is without. And the axis that you're looking at is the percent of time in the channel that all of the particles have over the simulation time period. So what I just showed in the last simulation was a particle or a series of particles originating from the same source point. Now what we've done is saying, okay, well, if we have particles originating from all over, what is the amount of time or the percentage of them that will be in the channel over our simulation tidal cycle. And so I can cut myself off, but red indicates the 30-foot draft with and without islands. Blue is the 40-foot draft, and we have some issues with the results of the without islands case, so you're just looking at the with islands case. And then the green is that midpoint, so the 35-foot draft with and without islands. And so you can see there is quite a bit of difference in the amount of material that can either enter or reside in the channel. So we built a polygon to track when they go in and out of the shipping channel. And so there's quite a difference over time. And this is not a huge percent of particles, but it's an initial starting point of our next steps and what we're thinking about. So, as I said, these are for all of the particles, and while this is interesting, it's not really the most illustrative. So what we did is then map the source of the particles. So this is for the 30-foot draft with and without islands, and the color of the source point now indicates the percent of time of particles from that source point are residing in the channel. And you can see here, there's, maybe a slight difference in color. And actually, now that I'm looking at it on this TV screen, it looks like there's no difference in color. But the point is that there may be some differences, but they appear to be quite slight. What's interesting, though, is in this 1956 geometry with the 35-foot draft, we do see, or we start to see some considerable differences in their channel. It's not quite a resonance time, but the amount of time particles are residing in the channel with and without the islands. So an increase in particle time in the channel for the case of with islands as opposed to without, which is interesting. We also see a slight increase in time that particles are in the channel in this lower quadrant of the lake when the islands are present. So the last thing that I'll show is kind of part of our next steps. What we want to do is, now that we've identified pathways, now think more realistically, okay, if we do have a really fine particle, how long will it be in suspension, and what are the spatial extents to which those particles will be moved, and how realistic is it that a particle originating from here reaches the channel. So just as a summary, we performed a 30-day numerical simulation of representative winter type conditions for Lake Calcasieu, Louisiana. We did some CMS modeling that indicated that there are changes in that changes in the basin and channel geometry alone can alter the tidal statistics, like the tidal prism. And some particle tracking modeling indicates that the islands along the Calcasieu shipping channel, CSC, appear to retain sediment that may make its way towards the channel. And there are a number of ways that material could get in the proximity of the channel. And that is suspension by ship wake, which has been hypothesized by others, erosion of the islands themselves, and possibly erosion of the shoreline and/or interior wetlands. So again, these final steps that we'd like to take before we really think we've kind of not wrapped up this problem, obviously, but have gotten a better handle on how this system works in terms of sediment transport pathways. We want to look at the dependence of particle transport and, as I was talking about, the breadth or extent to which these particles may move, and look at its dependence on wind direction. So if the particles are in suspension for about a day, and the winds are predominantly out of the south versus the east, how does that affect where the sediment may go? We also want to identify potential hotspots of resuspension relative to island geometry. So thinking about how likely or frequent would it be over our 30-day tidal cycle that material would be resuspended, and that would then take the path of these particle transport modeling that we've been doing, and also identify pathway hotspots. So this is really interesting. So one thing that I've been thinking about is not just that we have the case of different channel depths, but we also have slightly different island configurations for each of these with island conditions. And so maybe trying to identify where exactly is the most common area that materials entering the channel. You know, is it further north or further south? Or we can actually see there are two gaps in this island here, as well as here, but this is a single island. So looking at how those different gaps may influence the pathways themselves. And with that, I will conclude and take any questions and conversations that folks may have. And thank you for your time.